Picture this: a deep, resonant toll shatters the silence of a medieval village, but it's not calling the faithful to prayer or marking the hour. Instead, it's a weapon, vibrating through stone walls and into the bones of those below. For centuries, the bells of Europe weren't just symbols of peace. They were instruments of terror, wielded by those in power to manipulate, intimidate, and even break the spirits of entire communities. This is the untold story of how something so familiar, so seemingly innocent, became one of the most feared tools of psychological warfare in history. Think about the sheer power of sound, how a sudden, deafening noise can freeze you in your tracks or send a jolt of panic through your body. Now imagine that amplified 100-fold, echoing across battlefields and through narrow streets, shaking the very ground beneath your feet. In an era before gunpowder, before modern artillery, the deep, thunderous peals of cathedral bells could be as disorienting as any physical attack. Siege commanders knew this. They'd ring bells relentlessly during attacks, not just to signal troops but to drown out orders, disrupt communication, and plunge defenders into chaos. The sound wasn't just noise, it was a weapon, calculated to unravel nerves and sow confusion at the most critical moments. But the fear of bells went far beyond the battlefield. In the superstitious minds of medieval Europe, their ringing carried an almost supernatural weight. Some believed the sound could drive away evil spirits or summon them. Others whispered that certain bells were cursed, their tolling an omen of death or disaster. Townsfolk would cross themselves at the sound of a distant bell at night, fearing it signaled an impending raid or the spread of plague. And in times of rebellion, authorities would silence bells altogether, knowing their absence could crush morale as effectively as their noise could incite panic. This is the hidden history lurking behind every chime you've ever heard, a legacy of power, fear, and the unsettling truth that even the most ordinary objects can become instruments of control when placed in the right or wrong hands. To understand why bells could strike such deep fear, we have to step into the medieval mindset where sound wasn't just noise but a language. Every toll carried meaning. The slow, mournful knell for the dead, the rapid, frantic pealing of an alarm, the rhythmic call to prayer that structured daily life. These sounds were so woven into the fabric of existence that altering their pattern could send shockwaves through a community. Imagine living in a world where time itself was measured by bells, where their absence left people disoriented, and their misuse could feel like a betrayal of the divine order. Take the passing bell, for example. Its purpose was solemn, to guide a departing soul to the afterlife and remind the living of their mortality. But in the wrong hands, that same sound could be weaponized. During sieges, invaders sometimes rang passing bells mockingly, signaling not spiritual transition, but imminent slaughter. The psychological impact was devastating. To hear a death knell without a body was to feel death hovering invisibly, a terror far deeper than any physical threat. Even the clergy, who traditionally controlled bell towers, weren't immune to exploiting this power. In times of unrest, church authorities might order bells rung incessantly, not to comfort, but to imply divine wrath, pressuring populations into submission through sheer sonic overwhelm. And then there were the bells that never rang at all. In some regions, silencing the bells was a punishment reserved for rebellious towns, a collective humiliation that stripped communities of their spiritual anchor. Without the familiar markers of time, villages descended into disarray. The silence itself became a weapon, a void where fear festered. It's no accident that reclaiming the right to ring bells became a symbolic act of defiance during peasant revolts, proof that in medieval Europe, controlling sound was just as potent as controlling swords. The bell tower wasn't just part of the skyline. It was the beating heart of power, its voice capable of bending crowds to obedience or stirring them to rebellion with nothing more than a change in rhythm. The sheer physical force behind a medieval bell's toll was enough to rattle more than just nerves. It could shake the very foundations of a town. Cast from bronze or iron, these colossal instruments often weighed as much as two fully grown elephants, swinging with enough momentum to send vibrations rippling through stone and soil. When set into motion, their low-frequency sound waves didn't just travel through the air, they pulsed through walls, rattled armor, and even made water in wells tremble. This wasn't just noise, it was a visceral, inescapable force that bypassed the ears to resonate in the chest and bones, triggering primal instincts of alarm. Consider the mechanics of terror at work. A single strike from a great bell like Russia's Tsar Kolokol, which weighed over 200 tons, could produce sounds exceeding 140 decibels, louder than a thunderclap or a roaring cannon. At close range, such intensity didn't just startle, it could rupture eardrums, induce nausea, and leave victims temporarily disoriented. Siege tactics exploited this mercilessly. Attackers would sometimes coordinate bell ringing with assaults, creating a wall of sound that made it impossible for defenders to hear shouted orders or approaching footsteps. The constant barrage eroded concentration, turning organized resistance into frantic chaos. But the psychological cunning ran deeper. Bell founders, often secretive guilds with closely guarded techniques, shaped their creations to maximize dread. By adjusting the alloy mix, thickness, and curvature of a bell, they could fine-tune its voice to carry specific harmonics. Some were engineered to produce a lingering, dissonant hum, stretching the unsettling aftermath of each strike. Others emitted infrasound frequencies too low for human ears to consciously detect, yet proven to trigger unease and even vertigo. This wasn't accidental. It was acoustic warfare centuries before the term existed. The terror lay in the unpredictability. Unlike the steady rhythm of church bells marking the hours, weaponized ringing had no pattern. It might erupt in the dead of night, jolting entire villages awake with the message, "You are not safe." Or it might cease abruptly during a siege, leaving an eerie void where defenders strained to interpret the silence. In an age when sound defined community and time itself, the manipulation of bells didn't just attack the body, it invaded the mind, turning a symbol of order into an instrument of exquisite psychological torment. One of the most chilling examples of bells turning the tide of battle comes from the siege of Antioch in 1098. As Crusader forces trapped inside the city walls grew desperate, their attackers seized the surrounding churches and began ringing every bell in a relentless, discordant chorus. Day and night, the metallic roar pounded against the defenders' ears, not just drowning out commands, but eroding their ability to think clearly. Chroniclers wrote of soldiers covering their heads with cloaks, unable to sleep or strategize as the sound infiltrated dreams and waking moments alike. The psychological toll was so severe that when the Crusaders finally staged a counterattack, they prioritized silencing those bells before even engaging enemy troops, proof of how profoundly sound could shape the battlefield. But defenders weren't powerless against this sonic warfare. During the Siege of Orleans in 1429, French forces under Joan of Arc turned the tables by using their own bells as a communication network. Each tower became a signaling post, with distinct ringing patterns coordinating troop movements and warning of English advances. The besiegers, accustomed to controlling the auditory landscape, suddenly found themselves outmaneuvered by a language of chimes they couldn't decipher. It was an early form of encrypted communication where rhythm and repetition carried life-saving intelligence across stone walls and through enemy lines. The psychological genius of bell warfare lay in its ambiguity. Unlike the clear threat of arrows or siege engines, the meaning behind the ringing was fluid. A sudden peal might signal an incoming assault, or just be another torment in an endless auditory barrage. This uncertainty forced defenders into constant vigilance, draining energy far more efficiently than physical combat. Records from the Siege of Rouen describe townspeople hallucinating phantom bells after weeks of bombardment, their minds unraveling under the strain. Even when no towers stood nearby, veterans of prolonged sieges reported flinching at the sound of church bells years later, their nerves permanently rewired by the trauma. Perhaps the most sinister tactic emerged during dynastic conflicts, where rival factions would seize control of a city's bells and repurpose their sacred tones. A bell that once marked weddings or festivals might suddenly toll for executions, its familiar voice now dripping with menace. This subversion cut deeper than any blade, transforming a symbol of community into a tool of oppression. In some regions, conquering armies would melt down captured bells to forge cannon, literally recasting voices of peace into instruments of war. The message was unmistakable. Resistance would be met not just with violence, but with the erasure of identity itself. What made these tactics so effective was their universality. Unlike spoken threats that could be dismissed or misunderstood, the language of bells transcended literacy and dialect. A child, a soldier, or a scholar all reacted instinctively to the alarm in a bell's pitch or the foreboding of a death knell. Commanders exploited this primal response, using sound as an invisible army that could penetrate fortified walls without a single breach. The true power of medieval bells wasn't in their metal, but in their ability to turn the mind against itself, proving that sometimes the most devastating weapons leave no visible wounds at all. Nightfall transformed the familiar sound of bells into something sinister, a weapon of fear wrapped in superstition. Across medieval Europe, the arrival of darkness didn't just bring shadows, it brought the dreaded toll of the night bell, a sound that could freeze blood in its veins. Unlike the measured daytime peals marking hours or masses, these after-dark rings carried no schedule, no predictability. When they shattered the silence, it meant one thing: danger was near. Some towns called it the curfew bell, a signal for all citizens to retreat behind locked doors. Others knew it as the witch bell, its chimes said to herald supernatural horrors lurking just beyond the firelight. The power of the night bell lay in its ambiguity. A single strike might warn of approaching raiders, or, as whispered in taverns and hearths, the flight of a witch overhead. Village elders stoked these fears deliberately, spreading tales of demons drawn to the sound of unholy ringing. In reality, the bell was less about supernatural threats and more about control. By linking its peals to imagined terrors, authorities could enforce curfews, suppress dissent, and keep populations obedient under the guise of protection. A well-timed midnight toll could send drunkards stumbling home, silence rowdy gatherings, or quash plans for rebellion, all without drawing a single sword. Records from 15th century Germany reveal how potent this psychological tool could be. In One Chinese letter, the local bailiff ordered the night bell rung randomly twice a week, claiming it warded off plague-bearing spirits. The result: streets emptied instantly and crime rates plummeted. No one dared test whether the threat was real. The mere suggestion of spectral punishment was enough. Elsewhere, priests would occasionally ring the bell during storms, declaring it drove back the devil's thunder. The line between spiritual ritual and social control blurred until the two became indistinguishable. But the terror wasn't just top-down. Communities internalized the superstitions, weaving them into folklore. Parents told children the night bell's echo was the sound of lost souls counting their sins. Midwives warned that its vibrations could steal the breath of newborns if a cradle stood too near the church. These stories persisted because they served a purpose, keeping people indoors, compliant, and above all, afraid of what might happen if they challenged the order of things. The night bell didn't just mark time, it marked the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Its sound a reminder that defiance risked inviting not just earthly punishment, but otherworldly retribution. Perhaps the most chilling accounts come from witch trials, where the night bell played a starring role in extracting confessions. Accused women in 16th century France described being kept in towers where guards would suddenly ring bells to test their purity, claiming only a true witch would cover her ears at the unholy sound. The psychological torture was brutally effective. After days of sleep deprivation and jarring peals, many confessed to anything. Here, the bell's sacred origins were twisted into something monstrous, its holy metal repurposed as an instrument of terror. Yet for all its darkness, the night bell also reveals something profound about medieval society, the thin line between faith and fear, between community and control. Its echo wasn't just sound, it was the voice of authority, vibrating through timbers and into the human psyche. Long after the Middle Ages ended, the dread of unexpected nighttime ringing lingered in rural folklore, proof that few weapons are as enduring as the ones we can't see, only here in the depths of the dark. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, it brought with it a new kind of terror, one measured not just in bodies but in sound. The relentless tolling of church bells became the grim soundtrack of the pandemic, a ceaseless reminder that death was everywhere, inescapable. Towns that once marked the hours with orderly chimes now drowned in discordant ringing, as funeral processions multiplied and gravediggers worked without rest. The sheer volume of the dead transformed the bell's role no longer a call to worship but a dirge for entire communities. The psychological toll was unbearable. Imagine living in a world where the bells never stopped, where every peal meant another neighbor, another family member gone. Chroniclers described streets filled with the sound of weeping, punctuated by the metallic groan of bells swinging day and night. In some cities, the constant ringing grew so oppressive that survivors begged for silence, convinced the vibrations themselves carried the plague. Superstition-fed fear rumors spread that the clapper striking the bell's edge released deadly miasmas, poisoning the air with each toll. Authorities in Strasbourg went so far as to ban bell ringing altogether, fearing the sound was literally killing people. Yet for others, the bells were the last tether to hope. In a world where medicine failed and prayers seemed unanswered, their ringing became proof that God hadn't entirely abandoned the living. Priests continued to sound the passing bell for each victim, not just as a ritual, but as an act of defiance, a refusal to let death pass unmarked. The bells named the nameless, ensuring even the poorest plague victims received some semblance of dignity. This duality, the bell as both omen and comfort, reveals the depth of medieval desperation. The same sound that signaled loss could also, in its way, promise that someone, somewhere, was still counting the dead. The plague years also reshaped the physical landscape of sound. With so many bell ringers succumbing to disease, towns resorted to crude automation ropes tied to hammers, weights, even trained dogs to keep the bells in motion. The result was a cacophony of uneven, jarring tones, stripping away the familiar harmonies that once ordered daily life. The dissonance mirrored the chaos outside, fields left fallow, markets empty, and the eerie quiet of homes where entire families had vanished overnight. Survivors wrote of how the irregular clanging seeped into dreams, blending with the cries of the sick until the distinction between waking and nightmare blurred. Most haunting of all was the legacy left behind. Long after the plague receded, the sound of a tolling bell could trigger visceral panic. Some villages abandoned their bells entirely, leaving towers silent for generations. Others repurposed them, melting down the metal to forge tools, as if destroying the instrument might erase the memory of its voice, but the association never fully faded. Centuries later, during later outbreaks, the mere rumor of a distant bell ringing at odd hours could send townsfolk fleeing, proof that the trauma of the Black Death had etched itself into the collective mind. The bells of the plague years didn't just mark death, they became death, their echoes lingering long after the last body was buried. High above the crowded streets, clinging to ropes thick as a man's wrist, the bell ringers of medieval Europe performed a dance with death every time they pulled. This wasn't just a job, it was a high-stakes art form, passed down through generations in secretive guilds that guarded their techniques like alchemists hoarding the formula for gold. A single misstep could send a ton of bronze careening off its beam, crushing anyone below. Yet the true danger wasn't just the physical risk, it was the power these men wielded over the collective psyche of entire cities. The bell ringers' guilds operated like medieval special forces, with initiation rites as rigorous as any knighthood. Apprentices spent years learning the precise muscle movements needed to control a bell's swing. Too much force, and the momentum could snap ropes or topple towers. Manuscripts from 15th century France describe training exercises where novices practiced blindfolded, their hands blistered from rope burns until they could feel a bell's position by the tension alone. The best could make bronze sing with terrifying precision, alternating between a soothing lullaby and a war drum's pulse depending on who paid their fee. And payment was everything. While some ringers were pious men bound to their churches, others were mercenaries of sound, auctioning their skills to the highest bidder. During the Milanese Uprising of 1480, records show rebel factions bribing guild ringers to strike the city's great bell in a rapid, staccato rhythm, a prearranged signal for insurgents to attack guard posts. When loyalists retook the tower, they executed the ringers not for treason, but for sounding the devil's cadence. The message was clear: controlling the bells meant controlling the narrative of order versus chaos. The guild's most closely guarded secret wasn't strength or timing, it was acoustical sabotage. By subtly altering the angle of a bell's strike or dampening its resonance with cloth-wrapped clappers, ringers could turn a triumphant peal into something unnerving. In 1623, a Spanish duke's private letters complained of his town's bell ringers making the noon chime sound like a death rattle after he reduced their wages. The psychological effect was immediate. Superstitious townsfolk avoided markets, believing the distorted tones foretold another plague. It took tripling the ringer's pay to restore the bell's proper voice. Perhaps no case reveals the guild's dark ingenuity better than the silent revolt of Ghent in 1396, when the city council refused to grant ringers the same tax exemptions as other artisans. Every bell in the city fell mysteriously out of tune for weeks. Investigations found no tampering, just impeccably timed, slightly off-center strikes that made harmonies grate like grinding teeth. The council caved within a month. The guild hadn't broken a single law, they'd weaponized dissonance itself, proving that even when bells rang properly, their masters could still make them scream. The peasant uprisings that flared across medieval Europe weren't fought with swords alone, they were waged through sound. When oppressed farmers and laborers rose against their lords, their first act of rebellion often wasn't an attack on a castle or tax collector's house. Instead, they stormed the bell towers in an age where authority dictated who could ring bells and when. Seizing control of these sonic symbols became the ultimate act of defiance. The moment rebels pulled those ropes, their message echoed for miles: "We are no longer obeying." Take the English peasants' revolt of 1381. After decades of crushing taxes and feudal oppression, the uprising began not with a battle cry, but with the chaotic pealing of village bells across Kent and Essex. These weren't the measured tones of church-sanctioned ringing. They were frantic, uneven, a sonic mirror of the social order unraveling. As rebel leader Wat Tyler's forces advanced on London, sympathetic bell ringers in the city's outskirts joined the chorus, using prearranged patterns to signal safe routes past royal patrols. For illiterate peasants, these rhythms functioned as an auditory map, guiding them through unfamiliar streets under cover of the noble's own sonic weapon. The aristocracy understood the threat instantly. Chronicles from the revolt describe panicked lords ordering their stewards to silence the treasonous bells before the sound could spread rebellion to neighboring manors. In some regions, authorities went further, dismantling bell towers entirely or melting down the bronze to prevent its use against them. A surviving decree from Suffolk mandates that no bell shall ring without the bailiff's leave for 50 years after the revolt, proof of how deeply the ruling class feared the power of uncontrolled sound. But the peasants' acoustic resistance didn't stop at signaling. They weaponized the very symbolism of the bells. In Hertfordshire, rebels dragged a captured tax collector to the base of a church tower and forced him to listen as they rang the bells until his ears bled. A brutal demonstration that the instruments of spiritual authority could become tools of earthly justice. Elsewhere, insurgents repurposed the sacred pardon bell, traditionally rung to announce royal forgiveness of debts, to mockingly forgive the nobility's sins of greed and cruelty. Each subversive toll reinforced the same message. The old hierarchies weren't just being challenged, they were being drowned out. The most ingenious tactic emerged during the German Peasants' War of 1525. Rebel groups lacking siege engines discovered they could use the low-frequency vibrations of great bells to weaken fortified gates. By synchronizing the swinging of multiple bells in nearby towers, they created resonant frequencies that shook mortar loose from stone, an early form of acoustic sabotage. Contemporary accounts describe defenders clutching their heads in pain as the vibrations turned castle walls into massive sounding boards, the relentless waves of sound making it impossible to concentrate or even stand steadily on the battlements. What made these rebellions so terrifying to the elite wasn't just the violence, it was the inversion of power. Bells had always been the voice of authority, their rhythms structuring the workday, their chimes legitimizing royal proclamations. Now that same voice was shouting revolt. When French peasants in the Jacquerie uprising rang church bells to summon their fellows in 1358, they weren't just calling for arms, they were redefining who had the right to control time itself. For a few brief weeks, the fields lay fallow not because lords commanded it, but because peasants willed it, their stolen bells marking a new kind of day. The aftermath of these uprisings reveals just how potent the symbolism remained. Even after crushed revolts saw leaders executed and villages burned, authorities often couldn't bring themselves to destroy the rebellious bells completely. Instead, they'd mute them, stuffing clappers with wool, chaining the bells' swinging mechanisms, or in one notorious case in Bohemia, pouring molten lead into the bell's crown to deaden its voice. These half-measures spoke volumes. The elite might temporarily silence the sound of dissent, but they couldn't erase the memory of what happened when the powerless got their hands on the tools of sonic control. The bells remained in their towers, waiting for the next set of hands bold enough to pull the ropes, and the next revolution loud enough to be heard across history. There's something profoundly unsettling about a silent bell tower, like a mouth sewn shut or a clock frozen at midnight. For medieval communities, the decision to strip their own towers of sound wasn't just practical. It was an act of self-mutilation, severing a vital sensory limb. When invaders approached or civil war loomed, towns faced an impossible choice: keep ringing and risk drawing attention, or go silent and lose their primary means of coordination. Either way, the absence of those familiar chimes left people adrift in time, cut off from the rhythms that structured their lives. Consider the siege of Carcassonne in 1240. As Crusader forces closed in, the city's leaders ordered every bell muffled with layers of wool and leather. Watchmen resorted to whispering warnings through the streets, their voices swallowed by the wind. Without the tower's voice carrying over rooftops, farmers outside the walls missed the alarm and were slaughtered in their fields. The silence didn't just hide the town, it blinded its people, leaving them vulnerable to threats they couldn't hear coming. Yet the psychological toll ran deeper. Medieval minds associated silent bells with divine abandonment. A chronicler from Breslau described the eerie stillness during the Hussite Wars. No angelus rang at dawn, no vespers at dusk. It was as if God had turned his face away. Townsfolk crossed themselves at the unnatural quiet, fearing it heralded worse to come. Some began counting hours by the gnawing in their stomachs or the length of shadows, makeshift methods that only heightened their disorientation. The tower's muteness didn't just conceal the community, it unraveled their sense of order, leaving them stranded in a world without markers. The paradox was cruel. Bells could attract enemies, but their absence invited chaos. During the War of the Roses, Yorkist commanders deliberately left captured villages' bell towers intact, not from mercy, but because silencing them made suppressing rebellions easier. Without alarm bells, resistance forces couldn't coordinate. One account describes a rebel leader in Lincolnshire trying to improvise with a dented cauldron and hammer, the pathetic clangs drawing more laughter than allies. The lesson was clear: a community without its bells was a body without a voice, easily overpowered. Some towns took drastic measures to preserve their sonic lifelines. In the Swiss Confederacy, villagers dug underground bell chambers, muffling the sound for distant ears while allowing low-frequency vibrations to guide locals. Others developed dumb bells, weighted ropes that could be felt pulsing through buildings as a silent alarm. But these workarounds only underscored the desperation. The true cost of silence was measured in missed weddings, unmarked funerals, and the slow erosion of identity. A Flemish proverb from the time put it bitterly: "A town without bells is like a bird without wings, alive, but no longer flying." Perhaps most revealing were the rituals surrounding a bell's return. When peace finally came to Siena after a brutal 17-month siege in 1555, the first act wasn't a victory parade, it was the cleansing and reconsecration of the great bell Santa Maria. Priests anointed its bronze with holy oil as crowds wept at the restored peals. The ceremony acknowledged what everyone knew: the soul of the city hadn't truly returned until its voice did. For all their power as weapons, bells were never just metal. They were the heartbeat of community, and their silence left wounds no enemy's sword could match. The deep, resonant voice of a church bell carried more than just sound, it pulsed with unseen power. In the shadowed corners of medieval Europe, where the line between faith and fear was razor-thin, bells weren't just tools of the divine, they were shields against the supernatural. Villagers whispered that a properly consecrated bell's peal could scatter witches mid-flight, its holy vibrations tearing through their dark magic like sunlight through fog. But this belief had a sinister flip side. If bells could repel evil, then evil might just retaliate. Tales spread of witches cursing bells in return, silencing them with a gesture or twisting their tones into unholy shrieks. In 13th century Normandy, townspeople swore a local bell tower rang on its own at midnight, the clapper moving as if gripped by invisible hands. Priests blamed a coven of witches dancing in a nearby field, their incantations vibrating through the earth to animate the bronze. The bell was eventually taken down and buried at a crossroads, a ritual meant to starve its connection to dark forces. Similar stories echoed across Germany, where bells that developed a reputation for ringing during storms were said to be answering the devil's thunder and were often melted down for new castings. The rituals surrounding bell consecration revealed just how high the stakes were. Before a new bell could be hung, it underwent an elaborate baptism washed with holy water, anointed with oils, and even given a name like a living child. In some regions, the bishop would breathe into the bell's mouth the open rim, symbolically imparting the breath of God. These ceremonies weren't mere formalities. They were believed to charge the metal with divine energy, turning it into a spiritual weapon. A 14th century manual from Burgundy warns that skipping any step risked leaving the bell vulnerable to infestation by shadow, a chilling metaphor for demonic influence. Yet the very measures meant to protect bells could backfire spectacularly. When a consecrated bell cracked or fell silent, panic followed. In Swiss alpine villages, such events were interpreted as signs that the bell had absorbed too much evil and needed to be destroyed before its stored malice leaked back into the community. Some towns opted for symbolic burials, lowering the defiled bell into a pit with the same solemnity as a funeral. Others took more extreme measures. Records from Bohemia describe bells being drowned in rivers or strangled by wrapping their clappers in thorns as if punishing a traitor. The most unsettling accounts come from witch trial confessions, often extracted under torture. In one notorious case from Lorraine, an accused woman claimed her coven had poisoned a village bell by smearing it with a paste of graveyard soil and bat's blood. The bell allegedly began ringing backward, a phenomenon witnesses swore they'd heard until priests exorcised it with fasting and prayer. Whether these stories were coerced fantasies or reflected genuine folk beliefs, their persistence reveals a profound truth. In the medieval mind, sound wasn't just vibration. It was a living force capable of carrying blessings or curses as surely as a river carries water. This duality, bell as protector and potential betrayer, mirrored the broader tensions of the era. A tool of the church could become a puppet of darkness. A symbol of order might suddenly scream chaos, and in the echoing silence after a bell's voice was forcibly stilled, people heard something perhaps more terrifying than any witch's curse, the sound of their own vulnerability ringing loud in their ears. The bronze that once sang from church towers across Europe often met a brutal end, not with a final toll, but with the roar of a furnace. As armies marched and sieges dragged on, the very bells that had called communities to prayer became prized raw material for war. Metal-hungry commanders saw these towering instruments not as sacred objects, but as stockpiles of artillery waiting to be unleashed. The process was chillingly methodical. Conquer a town, seize its bells, then feed them into the flames to be reborn as cannonballs. Records from the 30 Years' War describe wagons creaking under the weight of dismantled bells, their fragments destined for foundries where they'd be melted, molded, and fired back at the people who once revered them. This alchemy of destruction wasn't just practical, it was profoundly symbolic. A single great bell could yield enough bronze for dozens of cannonballs, transforming an instrument of unity into weapons of division. During the French Wars of Religion, Protestant forces deliberately targeted Catholic bells, melting them down to forge guns they nicknamed the voice of the Reformed faith. The message was clear. The old order's sacred sounds would literally become the ammunition of the new. Even more haunting were the accounts from the Ottoman sieges of Eastern Europe, where captured Christian bells were recast into mortars inscribed with mocking verses from the Quran, a deliberate desecration that struck deeper than any physical conquest. Yet the loss went beyond symbolism. Each melted bell erased a piece of auditory history. Medieval bells weren't interchangeable. Their unique blends of copper and tin gave them distinct voices, fine-tuned over generations. When Swedish troops looted Prague's bells in 1648, they didn't just steal metal, they silenced centuries of acoustic craftsmanship. The few surviving bells from this era, like the massive Maria Gloriosa in Erfurt, Germany, are miracles of preservation, having escaped wartime furnaces by sheer luck or hidden protection. Their resonant tones offer a rare window into the soundscape of the past, a world where communities could recognize their hometown bell's voice from miles away. The irony was cruel. Many of the cannons forged from melted bells proved disastrously ineffective. Bronze alloyed for musical resonance often fractured under the stress of gunpowder explosions, sending deadly shrapnel backward toward the gunners. English siege records from the 100 Years' War note entire batteries abandoned after bell metal guns burst upon first firing. Some commanders grew superstitious, refusing to use artillery made from certain captured bells, convinced the metal remembered its sacred origins and would rebel against its violent repurposing. Perhaps the most poignant Chinese letter came from the bell founders themselves. In secret workshops across war-torn regions, artisans began embedding lead plaques inside new bells, tiny time capsules bearing the names of lost predecessors and prayers for peace. A few even sabotaged their own work when forced to cast cannons, subtly weakening the bronze to ensure the weapons would fail. These quiet acts of defiance remind us that while war could reshape metal, it couldn't always erase the meanings communities had poured into it. The Great Melt silenced countless bells, but not the human stubbornness that kept trying to make bronze sing rather than scream. There was a particular rhythm to execution bells, a slow, deliberate toll that seemed to seep into the bones of everyone who heard it. Unlike the urgent peals of alarm bells or the steady chimes marking the hours, these notes hung heavy in the air, each one measured to match the final footsteps of the condemned. The sound wasn't just a signal, it was a performance carefully orchestrated to remind every witness of the price of defiance. From the scaffold to the gallows, the tolling synchronized with the executioner's movements, turning death into a public spectacle set to a grim, metallic metronome. Authorities understood the psychological power of this auditory theater. In medieval London, the bell of St. Sepulchre's would begin ringing at midnight before an execution, its deep tones rolling through the sleeping city like a warning. By dawn, the sound had drawn crowds to Tyburn, where the gallows stood as a permanent fixture of terror. The bell didn't just announce the event, it shaped it, its rhythm pacing the prisoner's last moments, from the final prayer to the drop of the trapdoor. Witnesses reported feeling the vibrations in their chests long after the rope had stopped swinging, a physical echo of the state's unforgiving power. But the ritual went deeper than intimidation. Execution bells often carried names like the dead knell or the sinner's toll, their very language reinforcing the idea that justice and divinity were intertwined. In some German towns, the bell would strike once for each year of the condemned's life, a chilling countdown that turned their existence into a numbered list. Elsewhere, the bell would fall silent just before the fatal moment, leaving the crowd straining in the quiet, a calculated pause to heighten the horror. These weren't arbitrary traditions, they were psychological tools designed to brand the memory of punishment into the public mind. The terror relied on familiarity. Most people heard these bells only a few times in their lives, but the sound was unforgettable. Parents would hush children at its first note, knowing what it meant. Merchants paused mid-transaction. Even animals grew unsettled, as if sensing the tension in the air. By the time the procession reached the scaffold, the bell's work was already done. It had turned a legal act into a communal experience, ensuring no one could claim ignorance of the consequences of crime. Yet the darkest irony lay in the bell's afterlife. After particularly notorious executions, some towns would silence the bell used that day, fearing its sound had become tainted by association. In one macabre case from 15th century Bruges, a bell that had tolled for a serial murderer was buried at a crossroads, its clapper removed to prevent it from ever ringing again. The act spoke volumes. Even the tools of justice could become too gruesome to reuse. The execution bell didn't just mark an end, it became a relic of the very violence it helped orchestrate, its silence as telling as its peals. Bell towers weren't just architectural marvels, they were sonic fortresses, engineered to dominate the landscape with sound. Their designs often hid military cunning beneath spiritual grandeur. Take the narrow, slitted windows found in towers across medieval Europe. Far from mere aesthetic choices, these precise openings acted like the mouthpiece of a colossal musical instrument, channeling the bell's vibrations into focused waves that could carry for miles. Builders in coastal regions like Normandy even angled these windows slightly downward, projecting sound over water with eerie clarity to warn of approaching ships long before they were visible. The effect was so potent that invading forces sometimes prioritized smashing tower windows to deafen a town's defenses before launching their assault. But the strategic genius didn't stop there. Many towers housed hidden chambers just below the belfries, small, fortified rooms where watchmen could surveil the countryside through peepholes disguised as decorative carvings. These spaces doubled as panic rooms during sieges, stocked with provisions and connected to escape tunnels. In Siena's Torre del Mangia, guards could monitor 3 different roads simultaneously while remaining invisible from the ground. The tower's thick walls muffled their whispers, turning it into a secure command center where the timing of every alarm bell could be calculated for maximum psychological impact. The materials themselves were weapons in disguise. Builders mixed crushed seashells or pottery shards into the mortar between stones, not just for durability, but to create a resonant cavity that amplified specific frequencies. Experiments with reconstructed towers revealed that certain medieval designs could selectively enhance the lower tones of a bell's peal, frequencies known to trigger primal unease. Meanwhile, spiral staircases weren't just space-saving. Their tight corkscrew turns slowed invaders, while their asymmetrical steps slightly taller on one side disoriented attackers unfamiliar with the pattern. Every architectural choice served dual purposes: heavenly music for the faithful, psychological warfare for enemies. Perhaps most ingenious were the sound traps built into cathedral towers like those at Chartres. Hidden apertures in the spire's interior created echo chambers that could multiply a single bell's strike into a cascading reverberation. To outsiders, it sounded like an entire phantom choir of bells ringing from empty air, a terrifying effect during sieges, when defenders would strike their great bell once, letting the architecture conjure the illusion of reinforcements arriving. Siege records from the 100 Years' War describe besiegers fleeing at this auditory mirage, convinced fresh troops were charging from unseen directions. Yet for all their martial ingenuity, these towers retained their sacred aura. The same physics that projected warnings could also blanket a town in comforting harmonies during feast days. Builders achieved this duality through adjustable louvers, wooden slats around the belfry, that could be opened to scatter sound broadly or closed to focus it like an acoustic arrow. In times of peace, the louvers spread joyous peals equally across rooftops. In war, they turned the tower into a sonic cannon, its voice sharp enough to cut through battlefield chaos. This versatility made bell towers the ultimate medieval multipurpose structure, part instrument, part weapon, and always a masterclass in the manipulation of sound and space. The legacy of this acoustic architecture lingers in unexpected ways. Modern stadium designers still study medieval bell towers for inspiration on directing crowd noise, while military engineers credit their layered defense concepts to these ancient sound fortresses. But perhaps the most telling proof of their effectiveness lies in the ruins themselves, where even crumbling towers, long stripped of their bells, still channel the wind into whispers of their former power. Standing inside one, you can feel how every stone was placed with intention, turning architecture into an extension of the bell's voice, and the bell into an extension of human will. Nothing shattered morale like the silence of a banned bell. When kings and bishops wanted to crush rebellion before it could spread, they didn't just arrest ringleaders, they silenced the towers. In 1382, after the English peasants' revolt, Richard II issued a royal decree stripping dozens of villages of their right to ring bells without a royal official present. The punishment for unauthorized ringing, death by hanging not just for the ringer but for any who gathered at the sound. The message was clear: the crown would rather hear no bells at all than risk them becoming a rallying cry again. But the bans weren't just about preventing signals, they were about erasing identity. In regions like Languedoc, where heresy flourished, Catholic authorities ordered suspect villages to surrender their bell clappers to the church. Without that vital piece of iron, the bells hung useless, their mouths stopped like gagged prisoners. Townsfolk described the soundless towers as ghosts, their hollow silhouettes a constant reminder of lost autonomy. Some communities resorted to banging pots or blowing horns to mark time, but the makeshift solutions only deepened the humiliation. A Breton proverb from the time lamented, "A town without bells is a dog without a bark, no one fears its bite." The psychological warfare reached its peak during the Reformation, when competing faiths weaponized silence. In Munster, radical Anabaptists seized control in 1534 and immediately muted all church bells, branding them papist idols. When Catholic forces retook the city, they retaliated by banning the rebels' makeshift wooden clappers, a deliberate attack on the new soundscape of dissent. Meanwhile, in Calvinist Geneva, reformers stripped bells from churches altogether, claiming their absence would purify worship. The result was chaos. Merchants missed markets, laborers overslept, and the entire city slipped into a disorienting timelessness until the council reluctantly reintroduced a single, strictly regulated bell. What made these bans so effective was their insidious reach. Unlike burning crops or executing rebels, silencing bells didn't just punish, it rewired daily life. In Spanish-occupied Flanders, records describe villagers kneeling in the road at the former ringing hour, whispering prayers because their bodies still expected the sound. Others developed phantom bell syndrome, jerking awake at dawn convinced they'd heard the forbidden chime. Authorities exploited this dependency, offering to restore limited ringing in exchange for higher taxes or military conscription. The tactic was brutally simple. First, they took the bell's voice, then they sold it back piece by piece. Yet the most revealing rebellions weren't fought with swords, but with stolen clappers. In the Alpine valleys of Austria, peasants under bell bans developed an ingenious system of stone bells, hammers striking hollowed-out boulders in coded rhythms that echoed through the mountains. When troops stormed one village in 1589, They found no weapons, just a circle of women and children rhythmically tapping granite slabs with mallets. The officer in charge, realizing he couldn't execute half the population for illegal ringing, settled for smashing the stones only for the villagers to resume weeks later with copper pots. The cat-and-mouse game lasted years, proving that even the harshest bans couldn't silence the human instinct to mark time together. Perhaps the most chilling legacy of these edicts lies in their afterlife. Centuries later, during the Nazi occupation of France, the Gestapo revived medieval tactics, ordering villages near resistance hubs to padlock their bell towers. The goal was identical: to sever the auditory threads binding communities. And just like their medieval ancestors, the French responded with covert bell radios, tapping messages through heating pipes or drainage systems. The lesson echoes across history: silence a people's bells and they'll find new ways to make the metal sing. When the Inquisition came to town, the first warning wasn't a knock at the door. It was the bone-deep shudder of the great bell tolling from the cathedral. This wasn't the familiar call to Mass or Vespers, but something far more ominous: the bell of summons, its slow, deliberate strikes pacing the march of black-robed inquisitors through the streets. Every peal was a psychological hammer blow, announcing that someone, maybe a neighbor, a friend, even a family member, was about to be dragged into the shadowy world of heresy trials. The sound alone could unravel a community, turning whispers into accusations and silence into guilt. The Inquisition's mastery of acoustic terror reached its peak during public interrogations. As the accused stood before the tribunal, a single bell would begin tolling overhead, not the usual resonant peal, but a muffled, irregular clang, its clapper wrapped in cloth to produce a sickly, distorted tone. Witnesses described how the sound seemed to sync with the rhythm of questioning, growing louder and more urgent as inquisitors circled closer to a confession. This wasn't accidental. Church scholars had studied how dissonant noise frayed concentration and heightened suggestibility. In the torture chambers of Toledo, prisoners later recounted how the bell's erratic strikes made it impossible to focus, leaving them grasping for any words that might stop the torment, even false confessions. But the true genius of the Inquisition's sonic warfare lay in its theatricality. Before an auto-da-fe, the grim spectacle of public punishment, town criers would parade through the streets ringing handbells, their shrill notes cutting through the chatter of markets and homes. The message was clear: attendance wasn't optional. By the day of execution, the entire city would be steeped in a soundscape of dread, from the dirge-like tolling of the death bell to the jeers of the crowd, amplified by the natural acoustics of town squares. Survivors' accounts from 16th century Seville tell of how the bells seemed to follow the condemned even as they were led to the stake, their final moments scored by the very instruments that had once called them to worship. Perhaps the most insidious tactic was the bell of secrecy, a specialized chime used in remote monasteries where the Inquisition conducted covert trials. Its unique, almost melodic tone signaled that all within earshot were forbidden to speak of what they'd witnessed on pain of joining the accused. The effect was so potent that entire villages would fall silent at its sound, as if the air itself had been sucked away. In the Pyrenees, farmers still recount legends of a valley where the bell's echo never faded, its curse binding generations to silence. What made these tactics so devastating wasn't just their brutality, but their perversion of the sacred. A tool meant to summon the faithful to grace had become an instrument of coercion, its voice twisted to serve fear rather than faith. Long after the Inquisition's flames were extinguished, the sound of a certain bell at twilight could still send old men crossing themselves, proof that the true power of these instruments lay not in their metal, but in the memories they etched into the human heart. The rhythmic language of bells wasn't just noise, It was a finely tuned cipher, as precise as a scribe's handwriting. Across medieval Europe, each village and city developed its own unique dialect of peals, a sonic Morse code that could signal everything from a barn fire to an approaching army. In the Swiss Alps, for instance, 3 rapid strikes followed by 2 slow ones meant wolves were near the sheep pens. Along the Baltic coast, a staggered sequence warned of pirate ships sighted on the horizon. These patterns weren't arbitrary, they were lifelines drilled into every child's memory until the tones became as instinctive as a heartbeat. The complexity of these codes could rival modern encryption. Some towns used overlapping rhythms from multiple bells to create layered messages like the Dance of the Bells in 15th century Bruges, where the interplay between the cathedral's great bell and the harbor's smaller one could pinpoint which city gate was under attack. Other communities embedded musical signatures, altering the pitch sequence to indicate the threat's severity. A surviving ledger from Rothenburg details how the town's bell ringer could convey the exact wind direction during a fire by emphasizing specific harmonics, allowing bucket brigades to position themselves upwind before flames spread. But this auditory language had a fatal flaw. It only worked when outsiders couldn't crack the cipher. During the 30 Years' War, Swedish troops exploited this vulnerability with chilling precision. After capturing a German bell ringer in 1631, they forced him to teach their soldiers local signals, then used the knowledge to stage false alarms. As townsfolk fled imaginary invaders, waiting mercenaries looted abandoned homes. The betrayal cut deep, not just because of the theft, but because the invaders had weaponized the very sounds meant to protect. Some communities fought back with sonic misinformation. Venetian records describe defenders during the War of the League of Cambrai deliberately ringing plague warning patterns when enemy scouts were near, knowing the false alarm would make besiegers hesitate. In the Scottish Highlands, clans developed decoy codes ostensibly signaling cattle raids, but actually coordinating guerrilla attacks. The most ingenious countermeasure came from the Dutch, who during the 80 Years' War installed secondary clappers in their bells. These hidden strikers produced slightly off-tune notes, allowing authentic warnings to sound subtly different from enemy mimicry. The true artistry lay in the bell's ability to speak volumes without words. In mountainous regions like the Tyrol, where echoes could carry messages across valleys, watchmen developed a system of delayed strikes. The first bell would ring a sequence, then a neighboring village bell would repeat it minutes later with added tones, creating a relay that could transmit information faster than a horseman. One remarkable account from 1482 describes how this network conveyed a Mongol raid alert across 300 miles of the Carpathians in under 2 hours, long before smoke signals could be seen. Yet for all their sophistication, these languages were fragile. When the Black Death wiped out entire villages, their unique bell codes often died with the last ringer. Later attempts to standardize signals during the Enlightenment stripped away centuries of regional nuance, reducing a rich oral tradition to bureaucratic charts. Today, only a handful of places like the Faroe Islands, where fishermen still interpret subtle bell variations to navigate fog, keep the old knowledge alive. The rest exist only in crumbling tower logs and the occasional folk song, their once vital messages now as silent as the empty belfries where they once rang. Some of the darkest legends whispered across medieval Europe weren't about ghosts in the graveyard, they were about the ghosts in the bell tower. Stories spread of bells that rang without human hands, their peals echoing through empty belfries in the dead of night. In Yorkshire, villagers swore the bell of Kirkdale Priory would toll 3 times whenever a death approached, its clapper moving as if swung by invisible fingers. Over in Brittany, sailors avoided ports where the Morven bell was said to ring before shipwrecks, its mournful tone rising from the waves like a drowned man's warning. These weren't just campfire tales, they were expressions of very real terror, a way for people to make sense of the unexplainable through the object that literally shaped their days. The most chilling stories claimed some bells weren't just predictors of doom, they were causes of it. A persistent legend from the Black Forest told of a bell cast during a famine, into which a starving beggar had allegedly thrown herself, crying, "I give my flesh to the metal." The resulting bell, nicknamed the Hungry One, supposedly rang with a distorted, wailing tone and was blamed for 7 unexplained deaths before being buried in unconsecrated ground. Similar tales surfaced in Transylvania, where a bell called Groza was said to contain the melted jewelry of executed witches, its sound causing crops to wither within earshot. Whether these stories held truth mattered less than their power. They transformed accidental cracks or flawed castings into evidence of supernatural malice. What made these legends so potent was their grounding in half-truths. Bell founders did sometimes add precious metals to their alloys, not for curses but to fine-tune the tone. A silver coin might soften a bell's voice, gold could brighten it, but to medieval ears, such alchemy blurred the line between craftsmanship and sorcery. When the great bell of Rouen cracked during a storm in 1342, priests declared it, vomiting the devil's breath, and ordered it melted down. The recast metal still bore faint markings resembling a face, likely a flaw in the mold, but townsfolk called it the Screaming Pope and avoided the tower at night. The folklore often mirrored societal fears. During waves of plague, stories proliferated of bells ringing backward, a physical impossibility, but one that resonated with communities witnessing the world turned upside down by disease. In Prague, a bell ringer's journal from 1580 describes silencing his tower after neighbors accused the bells of pulling pestilence from the clouds. Even the church occasionally fueled these beliefs. One 14th century bishop's edict mandated exorcisms for any bell that rang during a lightning storm, claiming it housed a trapped storm demon. Yet some legends took root in genuine tragedy. The Weeping Bell of Monte Cassino was said to chime softly during fog, its tone dampened by the tears of a monk who'd fallen into the molten metal during casting. Historical records confirm a fatal foundry accident there in 1211, though the details are lost. What matters is how the story transformed grief into something communal, a way for generations to mourn not just one man, but all the anonymous artisans who risked their lives shaping Europe's sonic landscape. These tales endure because they speak to something primal, the fear that the tools we create might turn against us. A bell that rings itself isn't just broken, it's alive. And in a world where sound equaled power, few ideas were more terrifying than that power slipping from human control. Today, when an old bell tower chimes unexpectedly, some still pause not out of superstition, but because centuries of stories have tuned our ears to listen for the echoes of the past in every peal. Thunderstorms didn't just bring rain and wind to medieval Europe, they turned bell towers into instruments of divine fury. When lightning split the sky, the sheer force of the storm could set bells swaying without a single hand touching the ropes. The result was an eerie, untethered pealing that seemed to come from nowhere, as if the heavens themselves were sounding the alarm. To villagers huddled in their homes, this unnatural ringing wasn't just unsettling, it was a portent. Some swore the bells rang backward during storms, their tones twisting into something unholy. Others claimed the clappers struck faster than any human could pull, as though invisible forces were hammering out a warning. Church records from Normandy describe priests rushing to secure their bells before storms, not to protect the metal, but to silence what they called the devil's counterfeit choir. Coastal communities lived with an even darker dread, the legend of the storm bell. Towering over ports from Brittany to Bergen, certain bells were said to have a cursed relationship with the weather. Fishermen whispered that ringing them during calm seas could summon gales, their vibrations stirring the winds like a spoon in water. The great bell of St. Malo earned such a reputation that sailors would cross themselves when passing its tower, fearing even its shadow could bring squalls. This wasn't pure superstition, there was a grain of truth in the terror. Bells cast with high tin content emitted sharper tones that carried unnaturally far over water, sometimes coinciding with shifts in barometric pressure that preceded storms. When the bell rang and bad weather followed, the connection etched itself into local lore. The fear ran so deep that some ports instituted strict, silent laws during certain seasons. In 15th century Cornwall, the bell at Tintagel was padlocked from October to April, its clapper removed lest its sound wake the winter winds. Similar taboos appeared in the Baltic, where iron chains were wrapped around bell clappers to muffle their voices when clouds gathered. The precautions reveal a profound medieval understanding of sound's power, not as superstition but as observed science. People noticed how low-frequency tolls carried farther in humid air, how certain harmonics seemed to vibrate in time with distant thunder. When they linked bells to storms, they were piecing together early acoustical meteorology, even if they framed it as magic. Yet the terror wasn't just about the weather, it was about who controlled the sound. During the Little Ice Age, when freak storms devastated crops, some lords exploited the fear by ordering extra bell ringing during droughts, claiming it broke the sky's stubbornness. When rain followed, as it eventually would, they took credit, demanding higher taxes for their divine intervention. Meanwhile, priests in the Alps developed elaborate rituals to baptize storm bells, immersing them in holy water to cool their tempers. The ceremonies drew crowds willing to pay for protection, blending faith, acoustics, and outright theater. The most chilling accounts come from shipwreck investigations. After the sinking of the St. Julian off Brittany in 1486, survivors swore the storm began the instant the harbor bell rang for evening prayers. The subsequent inquiry revealed the bell's tone matched the resonant frequency of the ship's mast, a fluke that may have amplified wind vibrations. But to medieval minds, the explanation was simpler. The bell had called the storm, and the storm had answered. Such stories clung to ports for generations, transforming practical navigation hazards into spectral punishment. Even today, some coastal villages keep their bells silent during fog, a whisper of the old belief that sound could shape the very air around it. What made the storm bell myth so enduring was their duality. A tool meant to guide sailors home could also, it seemed, lure them to doom. The same physics that let bells mark safe harbors also let their sound twist into omens. And in that tension between sanctuary and superstition lay the true power of medieval soundscapes, not in what the bells actually did, but in what people believed they could do when the winds howled and the sky cracked open above them. The Protestant Reformation didn't just challenge the authority of the Catholic Church, it declared war on sound itself. As reformers swept across Europe in the 16th century, their hammers didn't stop at statues and stained glass. They turned their wrath toward the bell towers, targeting the very instruments that had marked time, called communities to worship, and woven sacred sound into the fabric of daily life. To reformers like John Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli, these towering bronze symbols represented everything corrupt about medieval Catholicism: their lavish ornamentation, their deafening peals during feast days, their alleged power to ward off storms and demons. A bell's voice, once considered holy, was now branded idolatrous, a distraction from the pure, word-centered worship the reformers championed. The destruction was methodical. In Zurich, where Zwingli's influence ran strongest, workmen dismantled church bells and melted them down for mundane purposes, turning sacred metal into cooking pots and plowshares. Dutch iconoclasts in the Beeldenstorm riots of 1566 didn't just silence bells, they threw them from towers, laughing as they shattered on the cobbles below. The violence wasn't random, it was performative. A broken bell was more than a silenced instrument. It was a visible, audible rejection of the old order. Witnesses in Ghent described the eerie aftermath of these purges, streets littered with bronze fragments, and a silence so profound that birdsong seemed unnaturally loud. But the impact went deeper than symbolism. For ordinary people, the sudden absence of bells was psychologically destabilizing. Imagine waking to no morning angelus, working through the day without the rhythm of canonical hours, lying awake at night straining for the absent curfew chime. Chroniclers in Strasbourg wrote of villagers showing up hours late for markets, their internal clocks shattered. Others reported anxiety and insomnia, as if the missing sound had left a hole in the air itself. The trauma was especially acute in coastal towns, where generations had relied on storm bells to guide ships through fog. When reformers silenced the towers, fishermen refused to set sail, convinced the sea itself had grown more dangerous without the bell's protection. The reformers knew exactly what they were doing. By stripping communities of their sonic anchors, they weren't just cleansing worship, they were forcibly rewiring how people experienced time, space, and even divinity. In Calvin's Geneva, where only a single, strictly regulated bell was permitted, authorities replaced the old auditory rhythms with printed schedules and town criers. The message was clear: timekeeping now belonged to human institutions, not the church's bronze voices. Meanwhile, Catholic regions retaliated by ringing their bells louder and longer, turning sound into a weapon of ideological defiance. During the French Wars of Religion, besieged Catholics in Sancerre rang their last remaining bell non-stop for weeks. Its increasingly ragged tolls a sonic middle finger to the Protestant forces outside their walls. Yet some of the most profound resistance came from ordinary believers who refused to let their sonic heritage vanish. In secret workshops across Protestant territories, craftsmen recast fragments of destroyed bells into small, unassuming handbells easily hidden, but still capable of carrying familiar tones. Scottish Presbyterians, though officially opposed to popish bell ringing, developed kirk bells with distinctively plain designs, allowing congregations to keep their auditory traditions under theological cover. And in the Alpine valleys, where sound carried for miles, shepherds used coded horn calls to mimic the band peals, preserving the rhythms of prayer in everything but name. The Reformation's war on bells left scars that never fully healed. Walk through a Swiss village today and you'll notice something odd. The medieval church tower stands intact, but the belfry is empty. The silence is a monument to a time when faith was fought not just with words and weapons, but with hammers and furnaces. Yet even in their absence, the bell's legacy lingers in the way a certain quality of evening light still makes old farmers pause, as if waiting for a sound that hasn't rung in 500 years. The reformers won the battle against bronze, but they couldn't entirely erase the echo. The human mind can withstand hunger, thirst, and even physical pain, but few torments erode sanity as efficiently as relentless, unpredictable sound. Prisoners in medieval dungeons described a peculiar form of suffering that left no bruises but shattered resolve, the maddening peal. Unlike the steady rhythm of church bells marking the hours, these sequences were deliberately erratic, sometimes rapid-fire strikes, other times drawn-out pauses just long enough for hope to flicker before crashing back into chaos. Records from the Tower of London's torture logs reveal how interrogators would suspend a small bell directly over a captive cell, its clapper rigged to move at random intervals. Within days, victims would reportedly beg for any punishment, even the rack, if it meant escaping the sound. What made this method so devastating was its scientific brutality, centuries before modern psychology named the phenomenon. Our brains are wired to detect patterns. When confronted with irregular noise, the auditory cortex remains perpetually alert, unable to habituate. Medieval torturers didn't understand neural pathways, but they knew the effects. Inquisitors in Nuremberg kept detailed notes on optimal disruption sequences, alternating between high-pitched handbells and deep burdened tones to prevent the mind from adjusting. One account describes a heretic who cracked after 72 hours of this treatment, confessing to fantastical crimes like flying with demons simply to make the noise stop. The technique wasn't confined to dungeons. During the Albigensian Crusade, besiegers employed a scaled-up version, mounting bells on mobile frames to bombard enemy walls with dissonance. Defenders at Carcassonne reported hallucinations after nights of this sonic barrage, seeing phantom towers where none stood. The psychological calculus was precise. Irregular peals disrupted sleep cycles more effectively than constant noise, accelerating mental collapse. By the 15th century, some military manuals included bell regiments, teams tasked with maintaining round-the-clock auditory assaults, using coded sequences to maximize disorientation. Yet the true horror lay in the method's deniability. Unlike thumb screws or branding irons, the maddening peal left no physical evidence. Church tribunals could claim they never laid a hand on the accused while still reducing them to trembling wrecks. In one chilling twist, Spanish Inquisition archives describe prisoners being forced to ring the bells themselves as part of penitential labor, their own hands becoming instruments of their torment. The psychological impact doubled. Victims weren't just suffering the noise, they were complicit in creating it, blurring the line between torturer and tortured. Modern experiments confirm the medieval intuition. Studies on sensory deprivation show that unpredictable auditory stimuli trigger cortisol spikes higher than those caused by electric shocks. The infamous Muslim band technique used at Guantanamo, playing loud music on loop, mirrors the maddening peal's core principle. Both exploit the brain's inability to filter out irregular sounds, a vulnerability hardwired since our ancestors needed to jerk awake at every twig snap in the dark. The legacy of this acoustic torture lingers in unexpected ways. Some historians argue that the pervasive fear of unholy bell sounds during witch trials, the accusations of backward ringing or self-moving clappers, stemmed from survivors of sonic torture reliving their trauma. Their shattered minds truly heard the corruption others only imagined. Even today, certain medieval bell towers carry warnings for visitors prone to seizures or anxiety disorders. The ancient harmonics still resonate with terrifying potency. What began as a crude tool of coercion turned out to be a grim precursor to understanding just how fragile human consciousness is when sound becomes a weapon. On a smoke-choked battlefield where shouts dissolved into the clash of steel, bells became the unsung commanders of medieval warfare. Their voices sliced through chaos with a clarity no human herald could match, deep, resonant notes carrying precise orders across valleys and through the din of combat. The Burgundian army at the Battle of Nancy in 1477 relied on a system of tower bells to coordinate flanking maneuvers, their distinct sequences telling pikemen when to advance and archers when to loose volleys. But this sonic advantage came with a razor's edge risk. The moment an enemy learned your bell codes, they could turn your greatest strength into a lethal trap. The Siege of Harfleur in 1415 revealed just how devastating auditory deception could be. As English forces encircled the French-held town, their scouts had spent weeks deciphering the defenders' bell signals. When the time came to storm the gates, Henry V's troops rang a perfect imitation of the French retreat pattern, 3 quick peals followed by a long, mournful tone. Confused guards threw open the inner portcullis, only to be overrun by English longbowmen. The aftermath saw a gruesome innovation. Survivors reported the English stringing dead French soldiers from the bell ropes, their weight creating macabre, irregular chimes that further demoralized the remaining defenders. Clever commanders developed countermeasures worthy of spycraft. Venetian mercenaries in the Lombardy Wars employed tone layers, teams of ringers who simultaneously struck multiple bells to create harmonic interference. Even if enemies mimicked the primary signal, they couldn't replicate the precise interplay of overtones that marked it as genuine. Meanwhile, Swiss pikemen drilled to respond not just to the bell sounds, but to their absence, treating unexpected silence as a signal to fall back into defensive squares. The system worked so well that during the Swabian War, Habsburg forces resorted to kidnapping Swiss bell ringers, only to find the substitutes they'd planted couldn't reproduce the subtle wrist flicks that lent authentic signals their distinctive rhythm. Some of the most ingenious adaptations emerged during the Reconquista, where the Moors and Christian knights engaged in a centuries-long game of acoustic one-upmanship. At the Siege of Granada, Muslim defenders constructed false towers, wooden frames hung with bronze plates that mimicked bell tones when struck. By positioning these decoys away from the actual command posts, they lured Castilian assaults into deadly kill zones. The Christians retaliated with ghost ringers, boys trained to imitate the vocal timbre of specific bells. Hidden in ravines near Moorish camps, these human mimics would fake distress signals, sending defenders scrambling in the wrong direction. The true masterpiece of battlefield bell deception belonged to the Hussites during their 15th century rebellions. These radical reformers turned their wagon forts into mobile sound systems, mounting bells of varying sizes on rotating platforms. During battles, they'd spin the platforms to create Doppler-like pitch shifts, making their signals appear to come from multiple directions at once. Contemporary accounts describe imperial knights charging at phantom sounds, only to be shredded by hidden gunpowder teams. When Catholic forces finally captured a Hussite bell tower at the Battle of Lipany, they found its interior lined with sheepskins, an early form of soundproofing that had prevented enemies from overhearing command discussions during peals. This sonic arms race reached its peak with the development of cipher bells, instruments whose clappers could be adjusted mid-battle to alter their tone. A surviving example in Prague's military museum features 6 internal hammers, allowing a single bell to produce distinct codes by striking different segments of its rim. Guards protected these precious instruments with fanatical devotion. The loss of a command bell often meant the collapse of an entire campaign. After the disastrous Battle of Mohocs in 1526, Ottoman chroniclers noted with curiosity how fleeing Hungarian knights prioritized salvaging their bells over their king's crown jewels, proof that in the calculus of war, control of sound could outweigh even the lure of gold. What made these strategies so effective wasn't just their tactical brilliance, but their psychological dimension. Unlike visual signals like flags or smoke, sound bypassed conscious thought to trigger instinctive reactions. A well-timed sequence could make seasoned soldiers wheel about like puppets on strings, their muscles reacting before their minds could question the order. And in the fog of war, where rumors spread like wildfire, the sudden peal of an unfamiliar bell pattern could paralyze whole regiments with doubt. Long after gunpowder rendered towers obsolete, the legacy of these sonic battles lingered in the bugle calls of Napoleonic Wars, the radio codes of World War II, and even today's electronic signal jammers. The medieval commanders had grasped a timeless truth. He who controls the soundscape controls the battlefield, and sometimes the most potent weapon is the one that vibrates in the bones rather than the one that cuts through flesh. The deafening roar of the Industrial Revolution didn't just reshape cities, it rewrote the very soul of Europe's bells. As factories belched smoke and railways stitched continents together, the instruments that once terrified villages found a new purpose, not as weapons but as the heartbeat of modern life. Foundries that once cast cannons now poured bronze into school bells and town clocks, their chimes syncing the rhythms of industry. The transformation wasn't accidental. After centuries of war and upheaval, people craved order, and nothing signaled stability like the predictable peal of a clock tower, marking another uneventful hour. Yet traces of the old fears lingered in unexpected ways. When London's Great Bell of Westminster, now called Big Ben, first rang out in 1859, newspapers noted how its deep E-note triggered visceral reactions in Crimean War veterans, proof that the subconscious still associated certain frequencies with danger. Similarly, the famous Liberty Bell in America gained its crack not from revolutionary fervor, but from overly aggressive ringing during an 1835 celebration, as if the metal itself resisted being pressed back into ceremonial service after generations of martial use. The shift from terror to tranquility wasn't just technological, it was linguistic. Phrases like "saved by the bell," originally referring to sailors spared from shipwreck by fog bells, and "ringing true," from testing bell metal for purity, seeped into everyday speech, softening the instrument's grim legacy. Even John Donne's famous "Never Send to Know for Whom the Bell Tolls" took on new meaning in Victorian times, shifting from a wartime warning to a meditation on shared mortality. This rebranding reached its peak with the invention of the bicycle bell in 1870, a cheerful ding-ding that couldn't have been further from the death knells of old. But the past never fully faded. During World War I, when metal shortages forced governments to confiscate church bells for artillery, many communities hid their prized bronzes rather than surrender them. In the Austrian Alps, villagers lowered bells into lakes and swore oaths of silence. French resistance fighters buried them beneath manure piles to throw off German detectors. The most poignant act of defiance came in Warsaw, where occupation forces demanded the city's beloved Sigismund bell in 1941. Rather than hand it over, Polish engineers dismantled its 300-ton frame and hid the pieces across 6 locations, a risk that could have meant execution but proved how deeply the sound of peace still mattered. Today, when we hear bells marking weddings or holidays, we're hearing the echoes of a hard-won truce between humanity and its creations. The same physics that once made them instruments of terror, their ability to project sound for miles, to synchronize crowds, to bypass logic and vibrate directly in the chest, now make them tools of unity. Yet the duality remains. In Ukraine, where church bells fell silent for decades under Soviet rule, their resurgence after independence wasn't just religious, it was a sonic declaration that the community's voice couldn't be permanently muted. And when Notre Dame's bells rang out after the 2019 fire, the global reaction revealed how these ancient instruments still carry something primal. Not fear this time, but the collective relief of a near loss averted. The story of bells is ultimately the story of our capacity to take what was forged in violence and reshape it into meaning. The metal hasn't changed. The alloy still contains the same copper and tin that once fueled sieges. What's different is the hand on the rope and the ear hearing the sound across centuries of reinterpretation. every time a bell rings now, it carries not just its own tone, but the weight of all its previous lives, as war drum, as timekeeper, as alarm, as memorial. The sound may be peaceful, but the resonance is anything but simple. That piercing, unexpected ring in the dead of night, the kind that jolts you awake with a racing heart, hasn't lost its power over us. Even now, centuries removed from the terror of medieval siege bells, our bodies react to sudden chimes with the same primal alertness that once warned villages of approaching armies. Modern alarm systems exploit this instinct without us even realizing it. The shrill tone of a smoke detector or the pulsing wail of an emergency broadcast isn't just loud, it's engineered to mimic the irregular, urgent patterns of ancient danger bells, triggering a cortisol spike before our conscious mind can process the sound. Scientists call this the auditory startle reflex, but its roots stretch back to a time when bells didn't just signal danger, they were the danger. Horror filmmakers understand this deep-seated fear better than anyone. Think of the ominous tolling in The Exorcist as Father Karras approaches the possessed girl's room, or the distorted church bell in The Hunchback of Notre Dame underscoring Frollo's descent into madness. These aren't random choices, they're deliberate echoes of medieval superstitions about bells channeling evil. Even the trope of a phone ringing ominously in an empty house taps into the same unease that once made villagers cross themselves at an untimely bell. The sound designer for A Quiet Place revealed they tested dozens of tones before settling on the farmhouse dinner bell as the monster's trigger, because nothing screams impending doom to the human brain like metal clanging in the dark. Our modern soundscapes are still haunted by these ancient acoustic ghosts. Air raid sirens evolved directly from medieval warning bells, their rising and falling tones designed to cut through noise just as their predecessors once sliced through battlefield chaos. Their Amber Alert chime on your phone. Its staccato pulses mirror the coded alarm patterns used in 16th century fire towers. Even the familiar school bell, a sound most associate with mundane routines, retains traces of its coercive past. Studies show its abrupt, authoritative ring still triggers a subconscious stress response in students, a remnant of the days when bells enforced discipline through sonic intimidation. Yet the most fascinating survivals are the ones we've ritualized into harmlessness. Wedding bells, once believed to scare off demons that might curse the marriage, now symbolize joy, but notice how they're always rung after the ceremony, never before. That's no accident. It's a holdover from the superstition that premature ringing could attract misfortune. Similarly, the bells on Christmas Eve tradition stems from medieval villagers warding off winter spirits with peals of blessed bronze. We've forgotten the original fears, but the behaviors remain, woven into the fabric of our celebrations like silent harmonics in a long-forgotten chord. This sonic legacy even shapes urban design. Modern cities buffer residential areas from the constant ding of train crossings and construction alarms, not just for peace, but because neurologists have documented how unpredictable metallic noises spike anxiety levels more than other sounds. The same frequencies that once signaled Viking raids now trigger subway delays, yet our nervous systems still interpret them as potential threats. In Japan, engineers developed sound showers of gentle woodland tones to counteract the stress of factory bells, while in Sweden, hospitals use bell-free zones because studies show traditional nurse call systems elevate patient heart rates, proof that our medieval wiring hasn't caught up with modern environments. Perhaps nowhere is this more poignant than in conflict zones. During the London Blitz, church bells were silenced by law, reserved only to warn of German invasion. When they finally rang again on V-Day, survivors described weeping not just from joy, but from the visceral flood of wartime memories carried by those peals. Similarly, after the 9/11 attacks, the bells of Trinity Church near Ground Zero became a makeshift communication system when cell networks failed, their centuries-old resonance cutting through dust and chaos just as they once did through cannon smoke. The tools may evolve, but when crisis strikes, humanity still reaches for the same sonic anchors that steadied our ancestors, proof that even in our digital age, bronze and vibration speak a language older than words. The next time your phone pings with a notification or a car alarm jolts you from sleep, listen closer. That flinch in your chest isn't just annoyance, it's the whisper of 1,000 years of history, a reminder that some fears don't fade. They just change their tune. The deep toll of a bell carries more than sound, it carries centuries of human ingenuity, fear, and power. What began as simple instruments marking time or calling worshippers became tools of psychological domination, their vibrations weaponized to break spirits before a single sword was drawn. The story of Europe's bells isn't just about bronze and rope, it's about how societies learned to harness something invisible yet irresistible, the primal sway of sound over the human mind. Whether ringing to scatter witches, coordinating rebel forces, or shaking besieged cities into submission, these towering instruments proved that control over noise was control over people. Consider the paradox: the same bell that comforted a village with its evening chimes could, in different hands, become an instrument of terror. Its voice didn't change, only its intent. This duality reveals a profound truth about medieval life, where nothing was purely sacred or purely violent. Even the most benevolent tools could be twisted to serve power. The executioner's bell marking time to the gallows, the invader's cacophony drowning out defenders' orders, the cursed peals said to summon storms, all exploited the same vulnerability, our hardwired instinct to assign meaning to rhythm and resonance. Yet the legacy of these sonic battles isn't confined to history books. Modern emergency sirens, alarm systems, and even the jarring buzz of a smartphone notification owe their effectiveness to the same principles medieval commanders understood. Sound still dictates our movements, alerts us to danger, and even manipulates our emotions. Think of the adrenaline spike when a car horn blares or the calming chimes of a meditation app. The difference is that today we rarely question who controls these sounds or why. The medieval peasant knew exactly what it meant when the Lord silenced the village bell. In our era of algorithmic soundscapes, we've lost that awareness even as the techniques grow more sophisticated. There's a haunting continuity in how societies weaponize the familiar. Just as medieval authorities turned a symbol of community into a tool of oppression, modern governments and corporations harness everyday sounds, ringtones, elevator music, even the hum of traffic, to nudge behavior. The bells of the past were the original influencers, their rhythms structuring labor, worship, and rebellion. Now, digital pings and autoplay videos fill that role, their designers borrowing unconsciously from centuries of acoustic psychology. The stakes may seem lower, but the underlying game remains the same. Shape the soundscape, and you shape the people within it. So the next time you hear a bell, whether it's the cheerful ding of a bicycle or the solemn toll of a cathedral, pause for a moment. Beneath its surface melody lingers an ancient power, one that once commanded armies, shattered sieges, and whispered terror into the hearts of entire cities. That sound you're hearing isn't just vibration. It's the echo of 1,000 years of human conflict, innovation, and resilience, still resonating in the air around us. And if you listen closely enough, you might just hear the ghosts of history ringing loud and clear. If unraveling these hidden threads of the past excites you, there's more where this came from. Hit that subscribe button to join us as we keep digging into the forgotten corners of history. where every artifact, no matter how ordinary it seems, has a story waiting to shake the foundations of what you thought you knew. The past isn't silent, it's ringing. All we have to do is listen.